good evening, everybody. There's a couple of faces I've seen before, and I hope you enjoy the Thor story. Thor is predominantly a tungsten company. We do, on this front slide, have it dedicated, I guess, about 70% tungsten and 30% copper. It's probably more like 85% tungsten and the balance copper, but that's probably more my drafting than anything else. I'm not going to ask you to memorise that the normal legal disclaimer, but I do by law have to show it every time. Tungsten's not a commodity that a lot of people know much about, so it's probably worth spending a couple of moments on the tungsten business. Tungsten is the hardest metal known. Sometimes it's the most difficult as well to work with, but it is a metal that has a very, very high melting point, a very high boiling point. It is very, very corrosion resistant and very, very wear resistant. So it is used in things in industrial sense, in drilling equipment and wear parts, things that drive the engine of industry all use a little bit of tungsten. It's a relatively small market, but it is a market for commodity for which there are very, very few substitutes. Copper and the price of tungsten has gone up more than 50% since the beginning of last year. It is in January 2017, tungsten was about $19.50 a kilo. It's now about $32, $33 a kilo. This has been quite steady growth over the last 12 months, and there are people forecasting it will continue to go up. I'm not in a position to comment on how valid that will be. Only time will tell. But the forecasts are that tungsten pricing will continue to improve for at least a little while. The other commodity, copper, as I said, a relatively small part of our portfolio, a really exciting project in South Australia. But there are people now who comment and opine on copper who say that the price of copper is going to go from about the $7,000 a tonne it is at the moment to $8,000 a tonne in the foreseeable future. If that is the case, that's happy days for a lot of copper producers and also for us as we move our copper project forward. I think I've told you most of those things about what tungsten does. It has defence applications. It is considered a strategic commodity by the US Department of the Interior, not just for defence purposes, but also for various industry as it underpins infrastructure development and the mining industry in general, automotive, and a whole bunch of other applications. What is of interest in relatively hot off the press is that the US Congress House Committee is putting forward a proposal to Congress and on through to Senate. Eventually, one hopes to accelerate the development of tungsten projects or strategic metal projects in the United States, and tungsten is considered one of the strategic metals for that purpose. So watch for news on that coming up in the next over the next few months. That might be very good news for our tungsten project in Nevada. Our assets, very briefly, we unfortunately don't have any in production right now, generating revenue and hopefully returns for shareholders. We do have at Molyhil and at Kapunda projects that are at the feasibility/funding stage. And then at Pilot Mountain in Nevada, we have come up with a resource, a very attractive and quite sizable resource in tungsten terms, and are working towards pre-feasibility. And we have elected and told the market relatively recently, we're not in the market for new projects right now in the blue sky, in the grassroots department. We have 3 cracking projects. To do those and do those well, we are not going to be sidetracked by a bunch of new projects here and there that, to be honest, would distract us as we move forward with the core assets that we have. The first of our projects under discussion is Molyhil in the Northern Territory of Australia. It's about 3.5 hours drive from the regional centre of Alice Springs, a town of about 25,000 people, for those who do not know. Molyhil produced tungsten concentrates very briefly during the late 1970s, and then the Chinese, who dominate the tungsten industry around the globe, flooded the world market with tungsten. A whole bunch of mines in various parts of the world closed down, including Molyhil. That left an opportunity for Thor, who picked this project up some years ago, to come up with what we think is a relatively attractive investment proposition. In 2015, we produced a feasibility study that, in our view, had a very positive outcome and had an attractive net present value. Unfortunately, as we then started to market it to potential financiers for this project, the price of tungsten started to drop. And it kept on dropping, and it kept on dropping. And eventually we decided, well, it was going to be too hard. We would have to put it on the back burner for a period, as we did. Since then, as I've said, the price of tungsten has improved a little, and we are upgrading that definitive feasibility study right now. The resource size at Molyhil, if you look at that grade of 0.28% tungsten, doesn't sound very high, is it? But this stuff is about $32, $33 a kilo. If you compare that with copper, copper's about $7 a kilo, maybe $7.50 a kilo. You know, this is pretty valuable stuff, and so relatively modest grade visually is quite good gear. Now we've got 13,000 tonnes in the resource of at Molyhil, and each tonne of that commodity is worth $32,700 US. That's a lot of money, and with it we have some molybdenum. And that is a commodity that we also track. The price of molybdenum has gone up quite nicely in the last few months, and we're pretty happy about that, because while we expected the price of tungsten to grow, we did not really expect the price of molybdenum to go. So this is really good news for our project right now. You don't get all of the resource into an ore reserve, because you have to subject it to a whole bunch of mining costs and dilution, and you don't get, it just does not all translate from resource into reserve. What is in reserve is what can be economically mined and produced at a profit. We have upgraded the the reserve, and published that as of January this year. We now have a 7-year life of mine as an open pit mine, and for the first time in the life of Molyhil, we have been able to recognise that there is elements of that resource outside of the open pit shell that appear very, very strongly to be economic for a subsequent underground mining after the open pit life. So we have 7 years as an open pit mine, and we have at least a year or two, we believe, but still have to do some work on underground mining methods and geotech stuff, that we will have at least another couple of years after that as an underground mine. So we now have a project that is far more robust than the one that we produced the feasibility study on 3 years ago. The features of the feasibility study at the time were a net present value at a relatively heavy discount rate of $72 million Australian on an investment of about 64. So you get all your you get the $64 million back, and then you make another $72 million on top of that in net present value terms. It's got free cash flow of about $200 million. We have a life of mine operating costs of, this is in metric ton units, which is basically, it's $112 there it says. That's about $11.20 per kilo versus a price today of $32.70 per kilo. So there's a fair margin to make some money out of this project as we move on. We're not going to produce sufficient tungsten to make a mess of the world tungsten price. We will produce on an annual basis around 1.5% of world demand for tungsten. So this is not going to upset the market. It should be absorbed quite quickly, and we believe we are in a process of finishing off the feasibility, an upgrade to this feasibility study. We will have that out in the next month or two, and we'll be off looking for finance for Molyhil. From the time we get finance, and I'm not going to underwrite when we do get that finance, but from the time we get finance, the construction and development period for the first product to roll out of the gate is 1 year. So this is a relatively short investment horizon, and because we have relatively high grades closer to surface, we get payback on Molyhil in about 18 months from first production, which is a relatively, again, quite an attractive investment scenario. Moving on across the Pacific to the United States, in Nevada, we have the Pilot Mountain project. It's about 2.5 hours southeast of Reno, on the road between Reno and Las Vegas. Again, we have tungsten, again it's tungsten in the form of scheelite. We also at Pilot Mountain have some copper, some zinc, and some silver. Union Carbide acquired Pilot Mountain in 1978 for, from memory, $8 million US. They were going to make it a big tungsten mine for their own purposes, and at the same time Molyhil closed down because the Chinese flooded the market. Union Carbide closed their mines in California, the Bishop mine, and also walked away from Pilot Mountain, not because they couldn't find enough tungsten to make it work, it's because the market for the commodity fell through the floor. It's very close to infrastructure, and it is a project that we believe can be brought into production not as quickly as Molyhil, because there is we have more environmental work to do. It is a little bit behind Molyhil in that department, but it can be brought. But when it does come in, we believe it will be relatively modest cost to bring into production, because it is close to infrastructure. You don't have to build a camp. You don't have to fly your workers in and out. There's bitumen roads within half an hour. There's mains power nearby. This, we believe, is going to be a relatively cheap operation to bring into production and to run. We have a resource at Pilot Mountain. We don't yet have a reserve. We are working on that over time. But we have in total almost 12 million tonnes containing 32,700 tonnes of contained tungsten. And remember, that 32,700 tonnes is worth about $32,700 a tonne currently. That's a big number. We also have some silver, about 190 tonnes of silver. That's worth about a couple of $100 million US, and some copper. There is also some zinc, but the zinc in the system is not at a there is not sufficient drilling and recording of zinc in the historical drill intersections for us to be able to quote a zinc number in the resource. But there will be some zinc in the system, and there will be some zinc there that we can recover and get paid for. As I said earlier on, tungsten has been classified as a critical commodity by the US Department of the Interior, and the US government is now moving towards accelerating the permitting for critical minerals. So watch this space. This may just over the next little while become a project where accelerated development is possible. I'm not saying will, but it certainly is possible. Over the last year or so, we have done a reasonable amount of drilling at Pilot Mountain, and the 10 million tonne resource at the Desert Shearlight deposit is exclusively on this zone of mineralisation here that I've got the pointer running over. The one just to the right, or in fact to the north, was newly discovered last year. If that sustains additional drilling later on to confirm it, you could potentially double the 10 million tonnes we have at the Desert Shearlight deposit. The other deposit at Garnet that is in the resource, relatively small, only a couple of million tonnes, but at 0.36%, this is quite high grade. This is quite high grade tungsten. The next stages of work at Pilot Mountain. We're doing some scoping work to allow us to go to the regulator and talk about the things we need to do to get this permitting process started. And we hope to be able to be in a position to talk to the regulator about things of that nature and kick that process off in the next 2 to 3 months. We're doing the next stage of metallurgical test work. When Thor acquired Pilot Mountain project several years ago, we did it in the knowledge that sufficient test work had been done in the metallurgical labs to know that we could produce a saleable shearlight concentrate and a saleable copper concentrate. What we did not have was sufficient work to say to know what a fully costed flow sheet would look like, and to produce a specifications for equipment for a feasibility study. That's the stage we're going at now in the second stage of metallurgical test work, and that work has been commissioned. We are also on the process. If I were to go back to the resource statement for Garnet, it is all in the inferred bracket. So for it to for us to include it in an ore reserve, we need to do some more drilling to get it into either indicated or measured category. And so we will go back and do more of that this year. How am I going? Running out of time. Finally, Kapunda Copper Project. Kapunda is about 90 minutes north of Adelaide, where I live in South Australia. It is the home of copper mining in Australia, where copper mining first started. Back in the late 1800s, people were mining very, very high-grade copper, 20–30% copper from Kapunda, and putting it on ships and sending it back here to the UK. They left a low-grade halo behind, which we are proposing to work on exploiting, and we are proposing to do that using in situ leaching or in situ recovery methods. We announced a couple of weeks ago a resource estimate for Kapunda that comes in at 119,000 tonnes of contained copper. That grade looks a bit low. It's not low for in situ leaching. In situ leaching is extraordinarily cheap mining and processing. Yeah, the analogy for this one is Excelsior Mining's Gunnison project in Arizona in the United States, where they have a copper deposit of about this sort of grade. They estimated in their feasibility study they would produce copper for all-in sustaining costs, which is their capital, their operating costs, everything, for less than $3,000 US a tonne. When the prices $7,000 US a tonne. This is quite a profitable business with very low grade copper, which is so don't get concerned about the grade. This is fine for in situ recovery techniques. The process basically involves you push a solution of what we call a lixiviant of material into the ground, which dissolves copper. It doesn't dissolve all forms of copper, only oxide and what we call the secondary sulfide copper. It does that, so you push that, you push the solution down into the ground in one hole, and out of surrounding holes you extract water or you extract that solution with the dissolved copper in it, and you then take it off to other places. You then take it off to a little plant where you go through a solvent extraction and an electrowinning process to produce cathode copper. I'm going to rip through this quite quickly now. There's what we have discovered last week is that, and announced in the last week, there is a high-grade core at a reasonably good jump in the grade to a bit over 0.3%, and we still manage to retain 75% of the copper in the resource. So what are we going to do about all these really good assets we have? Molyhil, we'll have the DFS out in the next few weeks, and then we're off to finance to develop this mine. At Pilot Mountain, we're working on the scoping studies and then feasibility and development permitting. And at Kapunda, we're working towards field recovery trials, proof of concept and feasibility study. And for all this work coming up in the next year, we are fully funded. We have enough money in our bank account to do all this work and still have some left over this time next year. So we're not here looking for money. We are here looking for people who would like to become part of the Thor story. Thank you very much.
Question time. Nothing new.
Can you say something about the lithium prospect in the United States?
Yes, certainly. We invested in a company called US Lithium in about June last year, and they have lithium opportunities in Arizona and also had them in New Mexico. We did some due diligence on that project, and because we had the opportunity to go from 25% to 100%, we were happy enough that the work we did verified that the information they'd given us about the quality and the quantity was about on the mark. So that we weren't disappointed by the quality of the work they did. What we were unable to do at the time was convince ourselves that it could be substantially better than they had put to us, and that was what we had hoped. We had hoped to drill. They had taken some surface samples and come up with some grades of lithium in those surface samples. We decided we needed to go a little bit deeper and see if it would improve in quality. The tenor of those results came back at around the same quality. We then decided that we would maintain our investment in that, but we would not take it through to a 100% acquisition, as we had that opportunity. Subsequently, US Lithium have taken steps. They are planning to list on ASX, and we're happy to be part of the story with that.
Good question.
Alamic, I'm an investor in Thor. The one thing that I want to ask is about the fact that Chinese had a big effect in the past. What is the risk in the future with the Chinese now?
Good question. Certainly in the early 1980s, China decided to drive the rest of the world out of tungsten. China holds about 2/3 of the world's tungsten reserves. They say they've only hold 50% of the world's tungsten reserves. We don't believe them. We think they hold more than that. They produce between 75 and 80% of the world's mined tungsten right now. So they are producing at in excess of their proportion of the reserves. What also is happening, however, is that Chinese costs of production are going up. The best, the highest grade deposits are no longer quite so high grade. The shallow deposits are now deeper and more expensive. Chinese labour costs are going up. And equally importantly, the Chinese government is becoming very environmentally conscious and has closed a number of not just tungsten mines, but mines for other commodities down for environmental purposes. China's not an open democracy, as we all know, and so making predictions confidently about their intentions over the next 10 or 15 years is probably fraught with difficulty. But every indication that we have in the tungsten business is that China is now of a mood to cut back its production a little bit, and for the rest of the world to start looking after its own tungsten requirements.
Thank you.
Next question. Anybody got a question? No? What's your news flow plan for 2018? Obviously, you've got 3 projects on the go. How do you see it panning out for the rest of 2018?
I think those who follow our stories probably acknowledge we manage to put out an RNS every week or every couple of weeks, and if it goes much longer, a couple of our directors give me a belt behind the ear and say, what's news? What is coming up? Certainly there is work on the feasibility study of Molyhil that I mentioned. There'll be news about that over time. And in the not too distant future. There's progressively news on Pilot Mountain as we go through this metallurgical test work, the scoping study, and the drilling that we plan to do. And we've just put some more news out about the Kapunda copper project. We are funded to do what we need to do, and therefore we have a budget to be active in all these 3 projects. So there's plenty of news flow throughout 2018.
Are you explorer or your miners? Are you actually going to take this through to production, or do you think you might sell on the assets once you prove them up completely and got things in place?
Yeah, good question. There's a number of people on our board are people who have worked in operating mines for many years, run mines, and are quite happy to do so again. The best way to sell a mining project, in my view, is to get that ready for production and try and get it into production. If you do a half-hearted job about it, no one's going to come and tap you on the shoulder and say, here's a bucket full of money, go away. So we plan to take these through to production. If at some stage someone taps us on the shoulder and says, here's a bucket full of money, go away, if that's a good deal for the shareholders, well, there we go.
And will that be at pilot plant stage, or do you think it will be at the fully financed stage and actually getting the buildings up? And because obviously that's where you're moving, isn't it?
We don't need to do pilot plant work at Molyhil, for example. We are proposing to go and build the mine. And we believe we will have the finance for that sometime this year. And so we will commence spending something like $40 million to build the mine and get it into operation. That is our plan, and that is our intention.
Great. Any other questions? Gentleman here.
Can you say a bit more about its uses in the electronics industry? It must have good conductivity for that purpose. I know it was used at one time for electric light bulbs, the elements, but of course that's not wanted now. It's switched over to LEDs. So what's the main use for electronics?
It does have electronic applications. I have to say it's maybe only a couple of % of the total use of tungsten of about 100,000 tonnes globally around the globe. But for those of you who have a mobile phone, and this is not really answering the question, when your mobile phone vibrates, the thing that vibrates has a little bit of tungsten in it. Not much, only a couple of grams. But I don't know how many mobile phones there are around the globe that vibrate when it rings or sends you a message, the other electronic applications are associated with the fact that it is plated onto some gear. It does conduct, but it also does not corrode.
Michael, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for your presentation. Thank you.